I came to my son Ethan's rehearsal dinner, carrying the same pearl earrings I wore the day I buried his father. I thought that meant something. I thought I meant something. The restaurant glowed with candles and champagne laughter, but the moment Ethan's fiancée pulled me into the hallway, the warmth disappeared from the room. Nicole smiled while fixing the diamond bracelet on her wrist. Then she leaned close enough for me to smell her perfume and whispered, "After tomorrow, you're not family anymore." For a second, I honestly couldn't breathe. And the worst part, when I looked across the room at my son, he wouldn't meet my eyes. If you've ever felt pushed aside by someone you loved after sacrificing everything for them, I want you to stay with me for this story. And before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I always read them late at night with a cup of tea beside me. And if stories about family betrayal, healing, and second chances mean something to you, don't forget to like and subscribe. Sometimes strangers understand our pain better than family does. My name is Leah Bryant, and for most of my life, being Ethan's mother was the center of who I was. Not my career, not my dreams, not even my grief. Just him. I was 28 years old when my husband Daniel died on a rainy November evening outside Dayton, Ohio. A drunk driver crossed the median and destroyed everything in less than 10 seconds. One police officer stood on my porch that night, twisting his wedding ring while I held our 6-year-old son against my chest, pretending I didn't hear the words coming out of his mouth. After the funeral, people kept saying the same thing to me. "You're still young. You'll find love again. At least you still have your son." But nobody tells you what it feels like to sit at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, staring at unpaid bills while your child sleeps in the next room, trusting you to keep the world together. Nobody tells you how humiliating it feels to smile at your son during breakfast after crying all night because the electricity bill is overdue. I worked everywhere I could. Mornings at a dental office, evenings waitressing at a family restaurant near Columbus, weekend bookkeeping for a small hardware store. There were nights my feet bled through my shoes before I came home. But Ethan never knew. Or at least, I tried not to let him know. When he was 8, he wanted a red bicycle for Christmas. I remember standing in Target holding that bike while secretly calculating whether I could skip my blood pressure medication for 2 weeks to afford it. I bought the bike. And on Christmas morning, Ethan screamed with happiness and threw his arms around my neck so tightly I thought my heart would burst. "You're the best mom ever," he whispered. For years, those words carried me through everything. When Ethan got older, I tried to give him the life Daniel would have wanted for him. I attended every baseball game, every school concert, every graduation ceremony. I still remember sewing patches onto Ethan's varsity jacket at midnight because I couldn't afford to replace it. I remember sitting in my car outside the community college financial office, crying because I'd just signed another loan document for his education. And I remember selling my wedding ring during Ethan's second year at Ohio State because his housing payment was overdue. I told him I had simply misplaced it. He believed me. Or maybe he wanted to. The truth is, Ethan was never cruel as a child. Sensitive, yes. Easily embarrassed sometimes, but never cruel. That came later. Slowly. So slowly, I almost missed it. It started after he got hired at a large investment bank in downtown Columbus. Suddenly, he was wearing tailored suits and talking about wine regions I couldn't pronounce. He started correcting the way I spoke at restaurants. "It's espresso, Mom, not espresso. Don't call it a purse. People say handbag. Little things. Tiny cuts. The kind you ignore because you love someone too much to admit they hurt." Then Ethan met Nicole Harper. The first time I saw her was at a charity gala Ethan invited me to 3 years ago. I almost didn't go because I didn't own anything elegant enough for the event. I spent 2 weeks searching clearance racks until I found a navy blue dress at Macy's that looked expensive if you didn't stare too closely at the stitching. Nicole walked into that ballroom like she belonged on magazine covers. Tall, perfect posture, blonde hair swept into a smooth, low bun, diamond earrings that probably cost more than my car. But it wasn't her beauty that unsettled me. It was how carefully she looked at people, like she was silently measuring what they were worth. When Ethan introduced us, Nicole smiled warmly. "So this is the famous Leah," she said. Famous. Such a strange word. She hugged me lightly, without wrinkling her white dress, and I noticed immediately how cold her hands felt. Still, I wanted Ethan to be happy. That mattered more than my discomfort. Over the next year, Nicole remained perfectly polite, always polite. But there's a difference between kindness and performance. Real kindness feels effortless. Nicole's kindness always felt rehearsed. At dinners, she asked questions about my life, but never really listened to the answers. She called me sweet, the same way people speak to elderly strangers at grocery stores. One Thanksgiving, I overheard her mother, Sandra Harper, whispering in the kitchen. "Well, she seems harmless enough." Harmless, as if I were a dog too old to bite. Sandra Harper came from old Chicago money and made sure everyone knew it. She wore silk blouses even at family cookouts and spoke constantly about private schools' vacation properties and maintaining standards. Victor Harper. Nicole's father was quieter, but somehow worse. He smiled often without warmth ever reaching his eyes. One Christmas Eve. Victor looked around my small house and said, "You've done surprisingly well for yourself." I smiled politely, while humiliation crawled up my spine. Surprisingly well, as though survival itself was unexpected for someone like me. After Ethan proposed to Nicole, things changed faster. He called less, visited less. Sometimes weeks passed before he returned my messages. And whenever we did talk, the conversations felt rushed, distracted. One afternoon, I invited Ethan over for dinner. His favorite meal pot roast with carrots and homemade rolls. He arrived late wearing a charcoal gray suit that probably cost half my monthly mortgage payment. Nicole wasn't with him. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah, busy." He barely touched his food. Then he glanced around the kitchen with an expression I couldn't understand. What I finally asked? Nothing. "No, tell me." He sighed heavily. "Mom, Nicole thinks maybe you should consider downsizing eventually." I laughed nervously. Downsizing. This house is a lot for one person. I stared at him. This was the same house where I'd raised him. The same hallway where I marked his height every birthday. The same backyard where Daniel taught him to throw a baseball before cancer took Daniel's father only months later. "This home is paid off," I said carefully. "I know. I'm just saying, maybe someday, does Nicole think I can't manage my own life?" Ethan rubbed his forehead. "Why do you always make things emotional?" That sentence stayed with me for weeks. Because once upon a time, Ethan had admired my emotions. Now they embarrassed him. Still, he was my son. And mothers are experts at forgiving slowly breaking hearts. So when the rehearsal dinner invitation arrived embossed in gold lettering, I ignored the unease growing inside me. I bought a new burgundy dress, had my gray hair professionally curled for the first time in years, and before leaving for the dinner, I opened my jewelry box and took out the pearl earrings Daniel gave me on our 10th anniversary, the last real gift my husband ever bought me before he died. I wore them because I wanted to feel like family. I just didn't realize someone at that dinner had already decided I wasn't anymore. The rehearsal dinner was held at a luxury restaurant overlooking the Scioto River in downtown Columbus. The kind of place where valet attendants wore black gloves and every table had candles floating in crystal bowls. I sat in my car outside for almost 5 minutes before going in. Not because I didn't want to celebrate my son, because something inside me felt unwelcome. I remember checking my reflection one last time in the rearview mirror. My silver gray curls were carefully pinned back, and the burgundy dress I'd bought fit better than I expected. I even wore lipstick, though I hadn't bothered with it much since Daniel died. "You look fine, Leah," I whispered to myself. But the moment I walked through those restaurant doors, I knew something was wrong. A young hostess smiled politely and checked her tablet. Name Leah Bryant. Her smile flickered. "Oh, just one word." "Oh." She scanned the screen again before forcing another smile. You've been moved to table 12. Table 12? I repeated. I believe there were some last-minute adjustments. I glanced around the room. Table 12 sat near the back corner beside the service station, where waiters carried dirty dishes through swinging kitchen doors. Meanwhile, Ethan and Nicole's families occupied the center tables beneath glowing chandeliers. I swallowed hard. It's probably temporary, I told myself. Still, embarrassment crept quietly up my neck. I made my way through the room, smiling at strangers, while trying not to notice how out of place I felt. Women in designer dresses clinked champagne glasses, while men in tailored suits laughed loudly about golf courses and investment properties. Then I spotted Ethan, my boy. For one brief second, my heart softened. He looked handsome in his navy suit, older than I remembered somehow, tired around the eyes. When he finally noticed me, he smiled quickly and walked over. Hey, Mom. He hugged me, but it was distracted. Half there. You look beautiful, I said honestly. Thanks. He glanced over his shoulder before speaking again. Sorry things are a little chaotic tonight. It's fine. But it wasn't. And deep down, I think we both knew that. Nicole appeared moments later, wearing a cream-colored satin dress that shimmered beneath the restaurant lights. Every hair on her head sat perfectly in place. Leah, she said brightly, kissing the air beside my cheek. Not actually kissing me, just performing closeness. I'm so glad you made it. Made it. As though I were a distant relative instead of the woman who gave birth to the groom. You look lovely, I said. Nicole smiled gracefully. You're sweet. There it was again. Sweet. The word people use when they can't think of anything truly meaningful to say. Before I could answer, Sandra Harper approached, carrying a glass of white wine. Well, there she is, Sandra said with polished enthusiasm. Leah, isn't this place divine? It's beautiful. Sandra nodded approvingly. Nicole insisted on elegance. Weddings reflect family standards after all. Something about the way she emphasized family made my stomach tighten. Victor Harper joined us next. Expensive watch, silver cufflinks, smile like polished marble. Leah, he said warmly. Good to see you. You too. Victor looked around the restaurant. Quite an event, huh? These things get expensive fast. Ethan laughed nervously. Tell me about it. Victor placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Well, investing in appearances matters, especially in certain social circles. I noticed then how Ethan straightened slightly after Victor touched him, like a boy desperate for approval from a father figure. That realization hurt more than I expected, because Daniel had been gone so long, and maybe Ethan had spent years looking for someone else to admire him. Someone wealthier, stronger, more impressive, someone unlike me. Dinner began shortly afterward. I found my assigned seat at table 12 beside Nicole's distant cousins and an elderly couple who spent most of the evening discussing arthritis medication. Meanwhile, laughter exploded from the main family tables across the room. I kept telling myself not to be sensitive. Not everything is personal, Leah. But then the waiter approached with place cards for the wine pairings, and I noticed my name had been printed incorrectly. Linda Bryant. I stared at it for several seconds. Not Leah. Linda. A completely different person. I quietly flipped the card face down before anyone noticed. Or maybe before anyone noticed that I noticed. The evening continued with speeches. Nicole's maid of honor cried while talking about sorority memories and girls' trips to Napa Valley. Everyone laughed at stories about yacht weekends and private ski resorts. I smiled politely, even though I'd never stepped foot in places like that. Then Victor stood to speak. He praised Nicole's intelligence, her ambition, her excellent upbringing. He praised Ethan too, though differently. We're proud Ethan has worked hard to elevate himself, Victor announced. Elevate himself. I felt the words like tiny needles beneath my skin. Sandra gave the next toast. To merging families, she said elegantly, and creating a future built on refinement, stability, and shared values. Again, that strange emphasis. Shared values? I looked toward Ethan. He avoided my eyes. That's when the loneliness truly hit me. Not because strangers looked down on me, because my own son sat silently while they did. When Ethan finally gave his speech, my chest tightened with hope. Surely now. Surely he would mention Daniel, our sacrifices, something real. He thanked Nicole first, of course, then the Harper family, then his college mentors, his business colleagues. Finally, after nearly 5 minutes, he glanced toward me. And thanks to my mom for always supporting me. That was it. One sentence. Polite, brief, forgettable. The room applauded. I clapped too because mothers learn how to survive heartbreak quietly. But inside, something cracked. I remembered sitting beside Ethan's hospital bed when he had pneumonia at 9 years old, staying awake for 3 straight nights because I was terrified he'd stop breathing. I remembered missing meals so he could eat better food than I could afford. I remembered every sacrifice I had buried deep enough for him never to feel guilty about them. And somehow, after all those years, I had become a footnote in my own son's life. As dessert arrived, I excused myself to the restroom just to breathe for a minute. The hallway outside the banquet room was dimly lit and quiet except for soft piano music drifting from hidden speakers. I stood at the mirror, pressing trembling fingers beneath my eyes. "Don't cry," I whispered. "You are not going to cry here." That's when the restroom door opened behind me. Nicole stepped inside slowly. For a moment, she simply stared at me through the mirror. Then she smiled. But this time, the smile never reached her eyes. And suddenly, I understood something terrifying. The polite version of Nicole Harper I'd known for 3 years was gone. Nicole closed the restroom door behind her with soft, careful movements. Not angry movements, not emotional ones. That somehow made everything worse. The restaurant noise faded until all I could hear was the low hum of the bathroom lights and my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Nicole adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist while studying my reflection in the mirror. Her face looked flawless beneath the warm lighting. Calm, controlled. Beautiful in the way expensive department store mannequins are beautiful. Empty behind the eyes. "You okay?" she asked lightly. The question sounded polite, but there was something underneath it. Something sharp. "I'm fine," I answered. Nicole tilted her head slightly. "You seem emotional tonight." I forced a small smile. "It's a wedding weekend. Emotions are normal." "Yes," she said softly. "I suppose they are?" Then she stepped closer, close enough for me to smell vanilla perfume and champagne on her breath. I suddenly became aware of how alone we were back there. "You know, Nicole said I've been very patient these last few years." I frowned slightly. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Oh, I think you do." Her tone remained smooth, almost friendly. "That attachment Ethan has to you, it's unhealthy." For a moment, I honestly thought I'd misheard her. "Excuse me." Nicole folded her arms carefully. "He feels responsible for your happiness, your finances, your loneliness. That's not normal for a grown man about to start his own family." I stared at her. "I never asked Ethan to take care of me." "No," she replied. "That's the problem. You don't have to ask. Guilt does the work for you." The words hit me so hard I physically stepped back. All at once, memories flooded my mind. The weekly phone calls Ethan stopped making, the canceled visits, the way he sounded tired every time my name appeared on his phone. Had Nicole been feeding him these ideas for years? "You don't know anything about my relationship with my son," I whispered. Nicole smiled again, not kindly. "I know enough." My chest tightened painfully. "I raised Ethan alone after his father died." "And that's admirable," she interrupted quickly. "Really. But tomorrow changes things." There was that word again. Tomorrow. Nicole moved closer and lowered her voice. "After tomorrow, Ethan won't need you anymore." I felt my fingers go cold. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means," she said calmly, "you should start learning how to let go." I looked into her eyes then. Really looked. And for the first time since meeting her, I saw something raw underneath the polished charm. Contempt, not irritation, not annoyance. Contempt. Nicole thought I was beneath her. Worse than beneath her. Disposable. "You think I'm a burden?" I said quietly. Nicole didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached over and adjusted the collar of my dress gently, almost tenderly. "I think Ethan deserves freedom from obligation." Obligation. As though loving his mother were some exhausting debt. My throat burned. I have never stood in Ethan's way. Nicole laughed softly under her breath. "Oh, Leah. Mothers like you never realize when they're holding on too tightly. Mothers like me. You know exactly what I mean." No, I didn't, but I understood enough. Nicole saw me as outdated, emotional, small town, lower class, an embarrassing reminder of the life Ethan came from before he entered hers. And suddenly, every awkward dinner, every subtle insult, every uncomfortable silence over the past 3 years rearranged itself inside my mind like puzzle pieces finally clicking together. This wasn't accidental. It had never been accidental. Nicole stepped back toward the door. "I'm glad we had this conversation," she said smoothly. "It's healthier when expectations are clear." Then she opened the restroom door, but before leaving, she turned one last time and whispered the sentence that would replay in my head for the rest of the night. "After tomorrow, you're not family anymore." Then she walked out, just like that, leaving me standing there unable to breathe. I gripped the edge of the marble sink until my knuckles turned white. For one humiliating moment, tears filled my eyes. Not because of what Nicole said, because part of me feared she believed Ethan agreed with her. I stayed in that restroom for several minutes, trying to steady myself. I splashed cold water on my face and reapplied my lipstick with trembling hands. "You are imagining things," I whispered to myself. "She's stressed. Weddings make people strange." But deep down, I knew better. You don't accidentally reveal cruelty like that. Cruelty leaks from somewhere real. When I finally stepped back into the hallway, I heard voices around the corner near a private service corridor. Nicole's voice and Sandra Harper's. I should have walked away, I know that. But then I heard Sandra say quietly, "Are you sure she'll sign tomorrow?" Every muscle in my body froze. Nicole sighed impatiently. "She'll sign. Ethan said she trusts him." Sandra lowered her voice further, but the hallway carried sound strangely. "I still think it's risky doing this before the honeymoon." "It has to happen now." Nicole snapped softly. "Victor already said the refinancing window won't stay open forever." Refinancing? My stomach dropped. Sandra sounded uneasy. "And Ethan?" "He'll do what he always does," Nicole replied coldly. "Avoid conflict and listen to whoever makes his life easier." The words sliced through me, not because they were cruel, because they sounded true. Then Nicole laughed quietly. "Honestly, once the papers are done, none of this will matter anyway." Papers. My heartbeat suddenly roared inside my ears. Papers. A memory flashed through my mind instantly. 3 weeks earlier, Ethan had stopped by my house carrying a folder. Just wedding-related stuff, he'd said casually, while standing in my kitchen. I remembered how rushed he seemed, how distracted. There are a few financing documents Nicole's planner suggested, some temporary paperwork for tax purposes. I hadn't signed anything then because he'd forgotten one page and said he'd bring the completed copies later. At the time, I barely glanced at them. I trusted my son. Now standing in that hallway, listening to Nicole and Sandra whisper about refinancing and signatures, something cold spread through my chest. The folder, the documents. Dear God. Had Ethan been trying to get me to sign something connected to my house, I backed away from the hallway before they could see me. My legs felt weak. Suddenly, the elegant restaurant seemed suffocating. The music too loud, the laughter fake and distorted. I returned to the banquet room in a daze. Across the room, Ethan stood beside Victor near the bar. Victor was speaking while Ethan nodded silently, his shoulders tense. For the first time in my son's life, I looked at him and didn't fully recognize the man standing there. Not because he had changed physically, because I no longer knew what secrets he was keeping from me. Ethan glanced up suddenly and caught me staring. For one brief second, guilt flashed across his face. Then Nicole appeared beside him, slipped her arm through his, and whispered something into his ear. And just like that, he looked away from me again. That was the moment fear truly settled into my bones. Not fear of Nicole, not even fear of losing my son, but fear that something far uglier was happening beneath the surface of this wedding, and I was the last person beginning to understand it. I barely remember leaving the rehearsal dinner. Everything after that hallway conversation felt blurred around the edges, like looking through fogged glass. I remember smiling mechanically at strangers. I remember Nicole hugging guests goodbye while acting like the perfect future bride. I remember Ethan kissing my cheek near the valet stand and saying, "Drive safe, Mom." And I remember wondering if my son had any idea that my entire body was trembling. The drive back to my hotel should have taken 15 minutes. It took nearly 40 because I missed two turns while replaying Nicole's words over and over inside my head. She'll sign. Refinancing. Once the papers are done. By the time I reached the hotel parking garage, my chest hurt so badly I had to sit in the car for several minutes before going upstairs. Maybe you're overreacting, Leah. Maybe it's innocent. Maybe you're letting insecurity poison your thinking. But another voice inside me whispered something colder. Then why did they hide it? I entered my hotel room, kicked off my heels, and immediately searched for my purse. The leather folder Ethan had given me weeks ago was still inside. I stared at it, sitting on the desk beneath the soft yellow hotel lamp. Such an ordinary object. Thin, beige, harmless looking. The kind of folder people sign every day without thinking twice. My hands shook as I opened it. At first glance, the paperwork looked exactly the way Ethan described it. Weeks earlier, financial forms, banking disclosures, legal language dense enough to discourage careful reading. I sat down slowly and forced myself to breathe. "Read carefully," I whispered. Daniel used to say that constantly. Read carefully, especially after he got sick. Toward the end of his life, Daniel became obsessively organized about paperwork, insurance policies, mortgage files, trust documents, wills, medical forms. At the time, I thought it came from fear. Now, years later, I realized it came from love. He'd been trying to protect us after he was gone. I adjusted my glasses and began reading line by line. The first few pages seemed routine enough: temporary lending authorizations connected to wedding expenses and future joint accounts. Then I reached page 7. My stomach tightened instantly. Property interest disclosure. I frowned. Why would wedding financing involve property disclosure? I kept reading. Halfway down the page, my home address appeared. My house. The small brick home Daniel and I bought 29 years earlier. The same house where Ethan grew up. I sat frozen for several seconds. No. No. This had to be some mistake. I flipped to the next page more quickly. That's when my blood turned cold. Conditional property transfer authorization. My name appeared in the signature line. Below it was language granting temporary access rights tied to refinancing collateral agreements. Collateral. I stared at the words until they blurred. They were using my house. Or trying to. A sound escaped my throat before I realized I was crying. Not loud crying. The quiet kind. The kind widows become experts at. I wiped my face angrily and kept reading. Then came another document. Durable financial power of attorney. My breathing stopped completely. The paperwork granted financial authority to Ethan in the event I became unable to independently manage my affairs. Below that, a recommendation letter draft for assisted living consultation services. I physically recoiled from the page. My hands started shaking so violently, the papers slipped onto the floor. "No," I whispered aloud. "No, no, no." I scrambled to gather the pages again while panic flooded my chest. Assisted living, I was 63 years old. I still drove myself everywhere. I paid my own bills, I gardened, cooked, volunteered at church. I was not mentally incompetent, so why would they prepare documents like these unless they planned to argue that I was? My vision blurred again. Suddenly, every conversation from the past year replayed differently in my mind. Nicole asking whether I ever forgot medications. Ethan insisting I let him help organize my finances. Victor casually asking whether the house had been recently appraised. Sandra suggesting retirement communities near Cleveland. At the time, each comment seemed harmless. Together, they felt terrifying. I stood abruptly and paced the hotel room. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might faint. Maybe Ethan doesn't understand what these are. That thought became my lifeline. Maybe Nicole and Victor handled everything. Maybe Ethan trusted them blindly. Maybe my son wasn't trying to destroy me. But another memory surfaced immediately. 3 weeks earlier in my kitchen. Just sign where the tabs are? Mom Ethan had said casually. He hadn't wanted me reading carefully. My stomach twisted violently. I sat back down and forced myself to continue examining the paperwork. Most of it was written in deliberately complicated legal language, dense paragraphs, technical financial terminology, cross-referenced clauses, designed to overwhelm people, designed for quick signatures. Then I noticed something strange. Several pages had sticky note tabs already attached, bright yellow tabs marking signature lines. Nicole's handwriting covered them. Just sign here, little smiley faces. Like this was friendly. Like this was normal. I suddenly remembered something Daniel told me years ago after a contractor tried to pressure us into signing an unfair roofing agreement. Anybody who rushes signatures is hiding something. At the time, Ethan was only 12 years old, sitting beside us at the kitchen table, eating cereal, while Daniel explained contracts to him. Never let people pressure you financially, Daniel had said firmly, especially people who act offended when you ask questions. I closed my eyes. God, Daniel would have seen through this immediately. But Daniel was gone, and I was alone. That realization nearly broke me. I looked toward the hotel window overlooking downtown Columbus. Rain had started falling softly against the glass, blurring the city lights. Tomorrow was the wedding. In less than 24 hours, Ethan would legally join himself to these people. And somehow, they were already planning my removal from his life. My phone buzzed suddenly on the nightstand, making me jump. Ethan. I stared at his name glowing on the screen. For a long moment, I couldn't answer. Then I forced myself to pick up. Hi, sweetheart. His voice sounded tired. Hey, Mom. You okay? I almost laughed at the question. Was I okay? My son had apparently participated in paperwork designed to transfer control of my home and finances. And somehow he still sounded casual. Yes, I lied quietly. You left kind of fast tonight. I was tired. A pause. Then Nicole said you seemed upset. Of course she did. I gripped the phone tighter. Ethan, what exactly are those documents you gave me? Silence. Not confusion, not surprise. Silence. Then he answered too quickly. They're just temporary financial forms. My stomach dropped. Why is my house mentioned? Another silence. Longer this time. Finally he sighed. It's complicated, complicated. Not untrue, not mistaken, complicated. Ethan, I whispered, what are you asking me to sign? His voice changed then, softer, nervous. Mom, can we not do this tonight? Tomorrow's already stressful. Stressful. As though I were creating drama instead of discovering betrayal. I trusted you, I said before I could stop myself. That sentence hung heavily between us. For a second, I thought Ethan might finally tell me the truth. Instead, he said quietly, you still can. Then he ended the call. I sat motionless in the hotel room, staring at the dark phone screen. And for the first time in my entire life, I realized trust could survive poverty, grief, widowhood, loneliness, but it might not survive your own child choosing convenience over your dignity. I didn't sleep at all that night. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up pretending and walked over to the hotel window with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. Rain streaked down the glass, while Columbus glowed beneath the dark sky. Somewhere out there, my son was sleeping peacefully beside the woman who had just tried to convince me I no longer belonged in his life. And somehow that hurt more than the paperwork, because documents can be challenged. But emotional abandonment, that cuts differently. I made coffee using the cheap machine near the television and sat back down at the desk with the papers spread around me like evidence from someone else's tragedy. I forced myself to examine everything again more carefully. The deeper I looked, the uglier it became. One document referenced future estate stabilization. Another outlined temporary property leverage agreements. There were even handwritten notes clipped to the back pages. Victor Harper's handwriting. House value estimate. Potential refinance timeline. Long-term care. Angle easier after marriage. I stared at those words until nausea rolled through me. Long-term care angle. Angle. Not concern. Not love. An angle. They weren't helping me. They were strategizing around me. I pressed my hand over my mouth as a horrible realization formed slowly inside my chest. These people had discussed my future, like business partners discussing inventory. And Ethan had sat at those tables. Maybe silent, maybe uncomfortable, but present. At around 4:30 in the morning, I finally did something I should have done weeks earlier. I opened the fireproof lockbox I always traveled with. Most people probably think that sounds paranoid, but after Daniel died, I became obsessive about keeping important documents safe. Insurance papers, tax records, legal files. Inside the box sat a thick envelope labeled in Daniel's handwriting. For Leah, important. I hadn't opened it in years. My fingers trembled slightly as I unfolded the papers inside. The first document was Daniel's original estate summary. The second was a list of attorney contacts. And tucked near the bottom was a folded yellow note in Daniel's handwriting. Leah, if you're reading this, something probably feels wrong. Trust yourself. Love does not require surrendering your dignity. My eyes filled instantly. Even after death, Daniel somehow still knew how to steady me. I pressed the note against my chest and cried quietly into the silence of the hotel room. Not dramatic crying, exhausted crying, the kind that comes when your soul realizes it's been carrying fear alone for too long. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Carol Mitchell. Carol had worked as a legal assistant for nearly 30 years before retiring. Sharp-minded, impossible to manipulate, the kind of woman who read every contract line twice and frightened salesmen without even trying. Daniel trusted her completely. So did I. I glanced at the clock. 4:52 a.m. Too early. But this wasn't normal anymore. I grabbed my phone and called anyway. Carol answered on the fourth ring, sounding half asleep. Leah. The moment I heard her voice, I nearly broke apart. Carol, I whispered. Something in my tone woke her instantly. What happened? And just like that, the entire story spilled out of me. The rehearsal dinner, Nicole's whisper, the hallway conversation, the documents, the assisted living paperwork, every terrible detail. Carol stayed silent until I finished. Then she said very calmly, "Take pictures of every single page right now." I immediately obeyed. For the next 15 minutes, I photographed documents while Carol listened carefully. When I finished, she said something that made my blood run cold. Leah, these are dangerous. I sat frozen. What do you mean dangerous? I mean sophisticated. Whoever prepared these knew exactly what they were doing. My throat tightened. Can they take my house? Not yet, Carol replied carefully. But if you signed all this without legal review, they could absolutely gain leverage over your finances and property. I closed my eyes. Oh my God. And this assisted living language concerns me even more. Why? Because establishing financial dependency and competency concerns together can create legal pressure later. The room suddenly felt smaller, hotter. You mean they could try to say I can't manage my own affairs? Yes. I physically recoiled from the words. But I'm fine. I know that. You know that. The problem is paperwork creates narratives. Narratives. I thought about Nicole calling me emotional, Sandra constantly discussing aging, Victor asking whether I ever planned to slow down. Tiny comments, tiny seeds, all designed to create a story. Carol's voice softened. Leah, has Ethan seen these documents? I hesitated too long. That means yes, she said quietly. I don't know how much he understands. Maybe not fully, Carol admitted, but enough to know this isn't normal wedding paperwork. I sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. The grief I felt then was almost worse than when Daniel died, because death takes people away against their will. But betrayal. Betrayal watches you cry and chooses silence anyway. Carol exhaled slowly through the phone. Listen carefully to me. Do not sign anything, not one page, and do not confront them yet. Why not? Because right now they still think you're unaware? That gives you an advantage. Advantage. I almost laughed bitterly. I didn't want an advantage over my son. I wanted my family back. But I already knew that wasn't possible anymore. The illusion had shattered. Carol continued carefully. Do you still have Daniel's original trust and estate records? Yes. Good. Bring everything with you today. Today, I repeated faintly. The wedding. I had almost forgotten. For one selfish moment, I considered leaving, driving home before sunrise, blocking Ethan's number forever. But then I imagined Nicole winning completely. I imagined them entering my home one day discussing renovations while treating me like an inconvenience to relocate. No, absolutely not. Daniel built that house with his own hands on weekends after factory shifts. Ethan learned to walk across those hardwood floors. My memories lived there, my dignity lived there, and suddenly beneath all the fear, something harder began forming. Anger. Not loud anger, not explosive anger, the calm kind, the kind women develop after surviving too much. Carol must have heard the change in my breathing because her voice softened slightly. There you are. What? The Leah Bryant I remember? I wiped my face. I don't feel strong. You don't need to feel strong. You just need to stop doubting yourself. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Carol said quietly, I'm driving to Columbus. You don't have to do that. Yes, she replied firmly. I do. Tears filled my eyes again. Not because I was weak, because after hours of manipulation and lies, simple loyalty suddenly felt overwhelming. What if Ethan hates me after this? I whispered. Carol answered immediately. Leah, any man who would hate his mother for protecting herself has already lost his way. I looked down at Daniel's handwritten note, still resting beside the scattered paperwork. Love does not require surrendering your dignity. For the first time since Nicole cornered me in that restroom, I finally believed it. And somewhere deep inside me, the frightened widow who spent years apologizing for existing began disappearing. In her place stood a woman who was finally ready to see the truth clearly, no matter how ugly it became. By 8 o'clock that morning, the rain had stopped. Gray clouds still hung low over Columbus, but sunlight pushed weakly through the hotel curtains as if the day itself couldn't decide whether to darken or brighten. I hadn't changed clothes, hadn't brushed my hair, hadn't even touched the untouched room service breakfast sitting cold near the window. I just sat at the desk, surrounded by papers, while waiting for Carol. Every few minutes, my phone buzzed with wedding-related messages. Nicole had created a group chat weeks earlier called Bryant Harper Wedding Weekend. Now it overflowed with cheerful updates. Can't wait for today. Hair and makeup starting. See everyone at the chapel by one smiley faces. Heart emojis. Champagne glasses. The fake normalcy of it all made my skin crawl. At 8:17, Ethan texted me privately. Morning, Mom. You okay? I stared at the message for a long time. Such a simple question. Such an impossible answer. Finally, I typed, "I'm fine. Busy getting ready." Three dots appeared instantly, then disappeared, then reappeared. Finally, he sent "Love you." I almost started crying again. Because that's the cruel thing about betrayal. People rarely become monsters all at once. Sometimes they still sound like the person you love while quietly helping destroy your trust. Before I could respond, another message arrived, this time from Nicole. "Today is going to be beautiful. Let's keep emotions positive and make Ethan happy." Positive. As though exposing manipulation would somehow ruin the mood. I locked my phone without answering. At exactly 9 o'clock, someone knocked firmly on my hotel door. Carol Mitchell walked in carrying 2 coffees and a leather briefcase. The moment I saw her, relief nearly knocked the air from my lungs. Carol looked exactly the same as always: short silver hair, sensible shoes, sharp brown eyes that missed absolutely nothing. At 68, she still carried herself like a woman who had spent decades dismantling lies professionally. The second she entered the room, she scanned the scattered paperwork across the desk. "Good," she said. "You kept everything." Then she set the coffees down and hugged me tightly. That's when I finally broke. Not dramatically, just quietly, my forehead against her shoulder while years of exhaustion leaked out of me. "I'm so sorry," I whispered. Carol pulled back immediately. "For what?" "For dragging you into this." Her face hardened. "Leah, stop apologizing for other people hurting you." The directness of the sentence stunned me silent. Carol removed her coat and sat at the desk, immediately organizing the documents into neat stacks. I watched her work with practiced precision. Legal forms, property disclosures, power of attorney language. Her mouth tightened more with every page. Finally, she looked up. "Who prepared these? I don't know." "Yes, you do," she replied calmly. And she was right. Victor Harper. Maybe through attorneys, maybe through financial advisors, but his fingerprints were all over this. Carol tapped one page sharply. "This section here is intentionally misleading." "What does it mean?" "It means they buried critical clauses under temporary refinancing language." My stomach twisted again. So they hoped I'd skim it. They counted on it. Carol adjusted her reading glasses. "And this part here?" She pointed to another paragraph. "This establishes financial dependency patterns." I frowned. "Dependency?" "Yes. If you sign this, Ethan gains increasing authority over property-related decisions connected to your home." My throat tightened painfully. "Why would Ethan agree to this?" Carol leaned back slowly. "Because people don't usually manipulate through force first." "What do you mean?" "They manipulate through shame." That sentence settled heavily between us. Carol folded her hands carefully. Leah, wealthy families like the Harpers survived by understanding emotional leverage. They identified Ethan's insecurity years ago. I stared at her. "He was always embarrassed by being poor," I admitted quietly. Carol nodded once, and Nicole offered him access to a different world. Country clubs, luxury, status, acceptance. I suddenly remembered how Ethan looked around my kitchen months earlier, like he no longer belonged there. Not disgusted exactly, ashamed. Carol continued softly. "That doesn't excuse him, but it explains why he became vulnerable." I sank slowly into the chair opposite her. For years, I had blamed myself for Ethan's growing distance. Maybe I talked too much. Maybe I called too often. Maybe widowed mothers become emotionally overwhelming without realizing it. But now I saw something else. Nicole and her family hadn't simply tolerated that insecurity. They had fed it, carefully, patiently, like gardeners watering poison. Carol picked up the assisted living paperwork again. "This part concerns me most because of the competency language, yes, and because it appears pre-planned." A chill crawled up my spine. What if they already spoke to attorneys? I'd assume they have. I looked toward the window, suddenly nauseated again. How did my life become this? Carol's expression softened, for the first time all morning. Because manipulative people move slowly. By the time victims notice patterns, They're already emotionally exhausted. That was exactly it. Exhaustion, years of small humiliations, tiny dismissals, subtle distancing, none big enough individually to justify confrontation, but together, devastating. Carol opened her briefcase and pulled out a yellow legal pad. Now she said firmly, "We stop reacting emotionally and start thinking strategically." I blinked at her. Strategically. That word sounded so foreign coming from someone like me. I wasn't strategic. I was a mother. But maybe motherhood had trapped me into confusing sacrifice with surrender. Carol continued writing notes. First, you will not sign anything today, obviously. Second, you will remain calm. That may be harder. Good. Anger clouds judgment. And Nicole is expecting emotional confrontation. I frowned. What if I just leave? Carol looked up immediately. No. The force in her voice startled me. You leave now, they control the narrative. Narrative. That word again. She'll tell Ethan you ruined the wedding out of jealousy or instability. Victor will reinforce it. Sandra, too. And Ethan, would he believe them? The terrifying answer was yes, at least partly. Carol leaned forward. Leah listened to me carefully. People like Nicole depend on appearances. Public image matters deeply to them. I nodded slowly. So don't give them a dramatic scene before they expose themselves. I swallowed hard. What exactly am I supposed to do? Carol smiled faintly. You attend the wedding. Every instinct inside me resisted the idea. I don't know if I can. Yes, you can. Carol's voice softened again. You've survived widowhood, debt, loneliness, and 30 years of single motherhood. You can survive one wedding. Tears burned my eyes unexpectedly. Not from weakness, from finally feeling seen. Carol reached across the desk and squeezed my hand. Leah Bryant, she said firmly, you are not the helpless woman they think you are. I looked down at our joined hands, wrinkled skin, wedding ring indentation still faintly visible after all these years. Quiet lives, invisible women, women people underestimate because we speak softly and cry privately. But surviving hardship creates a different kind of strength. Not flashy, not loud, enduring. Carol released my hand and stood. Now go shower, wear your pearls, stand up straight, and remember something very important. What she looked directly into my eyes. Being kind does not mean being weak. For the first time since the rehearsal dinner, I believed that too. And somewhere deep inside me, fear slowly began transforming into something far more dangerous. Resolve. The wedding morning felt unnaturally bright. By noon, sunlight poured through the cathedral windows so intensely it almost hurt to look outside. The rain from the night before had vanished completely, leaving the city polished and clean, as though nothing ugly could possibly happen on a day this beautiful. But ugly things happen in beautiful places all the time. Carol stayed with me while I got ready. Neither of us talked much. There was something sacred about the silence between older women who understand pain without needing every detail explained aloud. I carefully pinned Daniel's pearl earrings into place while standing before the hotel mirror. My hands were steadier now, not because I felt safe, because fear had finally burned itself into clarity. Carol watched me from the armchair near the window. You look strong, she said. I gave a small laugh. I feel about 90 years old. That's still younger than Sandra Harper's personality. For the first time all weekend, I actually smiled. Carol had always known exactly when humor mattered. At 12:30, my phone buzzed. Ethan. A strange heaviness settled into my chest before I answered. Hi. Hey, Mom. His voice sounded strained, like he hadn't slept either. I'm downstairs, he said quietly. Can I come up for a minute? Carol immediately looked at me. I hesitated. Every protective instinct inside me screamed no. But he was still my son. Yes, I whispered finally. 10 minutes later, someone knocked softly on the hotel door. When I opened it, Ethan stood there alone in his black tuxedo. And suddenly, for one painful second, I didn't see the 35-year-old man who had hidden dangerous documents from me. I saw the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, the teenager who cried after his first heartbreak, the young man who hugged me at his college graduation and whispered, "We made it, Mom." Grief hit me so hard I almost couldn't breathe. Ethan stepped inside slowly. His eyes immediately landed on Carol sitting near the window. A flicker of tension crossed his face. "Hi, Carol." "Ethan." Carol's tone remained polite, but cool. He shoved his hands into his pockets awkwardly. "I was hoping to talk to Mom alone." Carol looked at me instead of him. "Your choice." That's what the look meant. Not pressure, not control, just respect. I nodded slowly. "Could you give us a minute?" "Of course." Carol stood, grabbed her purse, and paused near Ethan before leaving. "I worked 32 years in legal offices," she said calmly, "so let me save everyone time." Ethan's shoulders stiffened immediately. Carol continued, "If anyone pressures Leah to sign anything today, I'll personally help her bury them in court." Then she walked out. The hotel door closed softly behind her. Silence swallowed the room. Ethan rubbed both hands over his face. "She always hated me." "That's not true." "She thinks I'm a villain now?" I stared at him quietly. "Are you?" The question visibly hit him. He looked away first. That alone told me more than words could. Ethan walked toward the window and stood there for several seconds before speaking again. "I didn't know everything. Not innocent, not unaware, just not everything." My chest tightened. "What exactly did you know?" He exhaled shakily. "That Nicole's dad wanted to use the house temporarily for collateral." Temporarily. Such a convenient word. Collateral for what, a refinance project? What project? I don't know all the details. I laughed bitterly before I could stop myself. "You expect me to believe that?" Ethan turned toward me sharply. "Mom, I'm trying here." "No," I replied quietly. "You're managing damage." The truth of it hung heavily between us. Ethan sat down slowly at the edge of the bed, suddenly looking much older than 35. "You don't understand what it's been like with them." I crossed my arms. "Then explain it to me." He stared at the carpet for several moments before speaking. "When I met Nicole, everything felt different." His voice sounded ashamed now. "Her family had connections, opportunities, stability. Were we unstable?" "That's not what I mean." "Then what do you mean?" He swallowed hard. "You spent my entire childhood struggling." The sentence landed softly. But softly doesn't mean painlessly. "I worked hard to give you a life." "I know you did." "Then why do you sound resentful?" Ethan stood abruptly and began pacing. "Because I was tired of feeling behind everyone else." The words exploded out of him before he could stop them. We both froze. He looked horrified immediately. But it was too late. Truth had entered the room. "I wore cheap clothes," he continued more quietly. "I avoided bringing friends home sometimes because I was embarrassed." I stared at him in disbelief. "Embarrassed? By me?" The word physically hurt. "I gave you everything I could." "I know." "You were fed, educated, loved." "I know." His voice cracked suddenly. And for the first time all weekend, I saw genuine emotional collapse instead of avoidance. Ethan pressed trembling hands against his forehead. "You don't understand what it felt like standing beside people like Nicole. People who already belonged in those rooms." I watched my son carefully then, and suddenly, I understood something devastating. This wasn't really about money, it was about shame. Somewhere along the way, Ethan had mistaken wealth for worth, and Nicole's family had exploited that insecurity perfectly. "She made you feel chosen," I said quietly. Ethan looked at me sharply. I continued softly. "Nicole made you feel like becoming part of their family erased the parts of your life you hated." His silence confirmed everything. My anger toward him shifted then. Not disappeared, but changed shape. Because sitting before me wasn't an evil man. It was a weak one. And weakness can still destroy people. Did you know about the power of attorney documents? I asked carefully. Ethan hesitated too long. My stomach sank. Ethan. She said it was precautionary. Precautionary for what? In case you ever needed help later? I'm 63 years old, not 93. I know that. Then why would you agree to something like that? He looked miserable now. Nicole kept saying you were isolated, that you depended on me emotionally. The humiliation of hearing my private motherhood reduced to psychological burden made my eyes sting. So I became a problem to solve. That's not fair. No, I whispered. What's unfair is discovering my son discuss my future like a financial inconvenience. Ethan's eyes filled suddenly, and seeing that almost broke me completely, because despite everything, I still loved him. Mothers don't stop loving, even when they probably should. I never wanted to hurt you, he whispered. But you still did? The room fell silent again. Outside church bells rang faintly across downtown Columbus. Time moving forward, whether families survive it or not. Finally, Ethan looked up at me with exhausted eyes. What happens now? Such a small question. Such enormous consequences hidden inside it. I thought about Nicole downstairs, preparing for the ceremony. Victor probably finalizing conversations. Sandra arranging flowers and appearances and social impressions. And I realized something terrifying. None of them believed I would fight back, including my own son. I looked directly at Ethan and answered honestly. That depends on whether you finally decide to tell the truth. Fear flashed across his face then. Not fear of me, fear of losing the life he had built around Nicole. And in that moment, I understood exactly how trapped my son truly was. Not by love, by the desperate need to belong somewhere he believed was better than where he came from. The wedding chapel stood on the edge of downtown Columbus, overlooking the river, wrapped in white roses and gold ribbons so extravagant it barely looked real. Everything about the day screamed perfection. Luxury cars lined the entrance. A string quartet played softly beneath the covered courtyard. Photographers floated through the crowd, capturing staged laughter and champagne smiles. And somewhere underneath all that beauty, my family was quietly collapsing. Carol arrived with me in a separate car. As we stepped onto the stone walkway leading toward the chapel entrance, I noticed people turning to look at us. Not rudely, just curiously. Older women notice these things. The tiny social shifts, the subtle whispers, the way people study your face when they suspect tension but don't yet understand why. Head up, Carol murmured beside me. I straightened instinctively. Inside the chapel lobby, wedding staff moved frantically between floral arrangements and seating charts. Nicole's planner, a thin woman with a permanent smile stretched across her face, rushed over immediately. Mrs. Bryant, wonderful you're here. Her smile faltered slightly when she noticed Carol. And you brought a guest? This is Carol Mitchell, I said calmly, a close family friend. The planner nodded too quickly. Well, we're keeping immediate family seating limited during the ceremony, but we can certainly arrange. She stays with me? I interrupted gently. The woman blinked, then smiled again with professional stiffness. Of course. Carol said nothing until the planner walked away. Then quietly, they're nervous now. I frowned slightly. How can you tell? Because controlling people hate variables. Before I could answer, Sandra Harper swept across the lobby, wearing a pale silver designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her perfume arrived before she did. Leah Sandra exclaimed loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. You made it. Made it. Again. As though my attendance remained somehow uncertain. Sandra leaned in to air kiss my cheek before her eyes slid toward Carol. Oh. That single syllable carried clear disappointment, Carol Sandra said politely. Sandra. No warmth, no performance, just cold civility. Sandra adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist. Well, she said carefully, today is such an emotional occasion. We're all hoping everything remains peaceful and joyful for Ethan and Nicole. There it was, a warning disguised as politeness. I smiled softly. So am I. Sandra studied my face for a second too long. Then she walked away. Carol leaned closer. She knows something shifted. She probably thinks I'm unstable. Carol snorted quietly. Women like Sandra always mistake calm for weakness until it's too late. Guests slowly filled the chapel. Everything smelled like lilies and expensive perfume. I watched Ethan greeting people near the altar through the open sanctuary doors. He looked handsome, polished, successful, and deeply unhappy. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in his shoulders. Every few minutes, his eyes searched the room, looking for me, looking away again once he found me. Like guilt physically hurt him. For one fleeting moment, I almost walked over and hugged him, almost told him we could leave together, start over somewhere simpler. But life doesn't work that way. Not once trust begins cracking underneath your feet. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Nicole entered the chapel like royalty beneath soft violin music, her cathedral-length veil trailing behind her, while guests audibly gasped. She looked stunning, cold, calculated, and stunning. When she reached the altar, Ethan took her hands. And for a second, I saw genuine love in his eyes. That complicated everything, because people assume manipulation always looks obvious. Sometimes it looks like affection mixed with fear. Sometimes victims help defend the people hurting them. I sat quietly beside Carol while the minister spoke about commitment, loyalty, and family unity. The irony nearly choked me. At one point, Ethan glanced toward me during the vows. Our eyes met. His expression looked almost pleading, as though he wanted forgiveness before confession. I didn't know how to give either anymore. When the ceremony ended, applause filled the chapel, while guests rose, smiling and cheering. Nicole kissed Ethan triumphantly beneath a storm of camera flashes. And suddenly, I understood something important. Nicole genuinely believed she had won. The reception took place inside a renovated historic ballroom overlooking the river. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors, while waiters carried silver trays through the crowd. Everything glittered, everything sparkled, and everything felt rotten underneath. Carol remained close beside me all evening, not hovering, protecting. There's a difference. As guests settled into their assigned tables, I noticed another subtle insult. My seat sat near the far edge of the ballroom, beside distant relatives again. Meanwhile, Victor and Sandra occupied the center table, directly beside the bride and groom. I almost laughed this time. The cruelty had become so transparent, it no longer even surprised me. Carol calmly switched our place cards with 2 empty seats, slightly closer to the front. "What are you doing?" I whispered. "Correcting disrespect." We sat down without apology. Across the room, I noticed Nicole spot us almost immediately. Her smile tightened. Good. For years, I had adjusted myself smaller to keep other people comfortable. Not tonight. Dinner service began. Toasts followed. Laughter echoed through the ballroom while champagne glasses clinked endlessly. Nicole played her role flawlessly, smiling, touching Ethan's arm lovingly, thanking guests with practiced elegance. But every now and then, when she thought nobody watched her, her expression changed. Sharp, watchful, calculating, like someone monitoring whether a plan remained under control. Halfway through dinner, I excused myself toward the restroom again, this time not to cry, to breathe. As I passed a side hallway near the ballroom offices, voices drifted through a partially open service door. Nicole's voice and Sandra's. I stopped instinctively. "You need to push the conversation tonight," Sandra whispered urgently. Nicole sounded irritated. "I know. What if she delays again?" "She won't." And Ethan. Nicole laughed softly under her breath. "He'll manage her. Manage her. Not support. Not love. Manage." Sandra lowered her voice further. "I just want this handled before they get back from the honeymoon. Victor's already counting on the refinance schedule." My stomach tightened violently. Then Nicole said something that froze my blood completely. "After the honeymoon, we'll move her out anyway." Silence. Then Sandra laughed quietly. At her age, living alone isn't exactly practical. Nicole replied coldly, she should be grateful we're even considering options. Options. Like relocating an unwanted tenant. I backed away from the hallway before they could see me. Every nerve in my body vibrated with fury now. Not fear anymore. Fury. I returned slowly toward the ballroom entrance, just as Ethan stepped out from another corridor nearby. The second he saw my face, his expression changed. What happened? I looked at him for several long seconds. This man came from my body. I had loved him before he even took his first breath. And somehow he had allowed people to discuss me like disposable furniture. You tell me? I said quietly. His face paled immediately. Behind him, through the ballroom doors, I could see Nicole laughing beneath golden lights while guests admired her perfect wedding. But suddenly, all I saw was illusion. Because beneath the flowers and music and crystal chandeliers, something ugly was preparing to surface. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I was no longer afraid of it. Ethan followed me into a quiet hallway beside the ballroom kitchens. Behind us, music and laughter continued floating through the reception, like nothing in the world was wrong. But the moment the doors closed behind us, the silence felt suffocating. What did Nicole say? Ethan asked quickly. Not, are you okay? Not what happened. What did Nicole say? Because deep down, he already knew. I crossed my arms tightly against my chest. I heard her talking to Sandra. The color drained slowly from his face. Mom? She said after the honeymoon, they'd move me out. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. That's not what she meant. The automatic defense came so quickly, it almost made me laugh. She also mentioned refinance schedules. I continued quietly. And your father-in-law counting on my house. Ethan rubbed both hands over his face. You don't understand the full situation. Then explain it to me. He looked trapped, like a man standing in the middle of two collapsing buildings, trying to decide which one would crush him first. Finally, he sighed heavily. Victor's company got into trouble last year. I stared at him. What kind of trouble he had investments fail? How badly Ethan hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. How badly I repeated. His voice dropped lower. Millions. The hallway suddenly felt colder. What Ethan shoved trembling hands into his pockets. He lost several commercial real estate projects in Chicago. Nicole said banks started pulling out after interest rates changed. I blinked slowly. And somehow this became my problem. It wasn't supposed to. Then what was supposed to happen? Ethan leaned against the wall and looked completely exhausted. Victor said your house could help stabilize temporary financing. My stomach turned. My home. It would have only been temporary. There's that word again. Mom. No. My voice sharpened for the first time all weekend. Stop saying temporary like it magically makes betrayal acceptable. Ethan looked down at the floor. I suddenly remembered him at 10 years old, hiding broken dishes behind the trash because he feared disappointing me. Same body language, same avoidance, just older now, and infinitely more dangerous. How long have you known? I asked quietly. A few months? A few months? My son had spent months smiling at me while participating in plans involving my home and finances. I pressed trembling fingers against my temple. Nicole said once we married, everything would stabilize. Ethan continued desperately. She said her father just needed breathing room. And what did they offer you in return? That question hit him immediately. I could see it, because there had been something, maybe not directly spoken, but implied, status, belonging, approval. Ethan swallowed hard. They promised partnership opportunities. There it was. Victor Harper hadn't targeted my house first. He targeted my son's insecurity. You sold your integrity for acceptance, I whispered. That's not fair. No? Then what should I call it? Ethan's voice cracked suddenly. You think I don't hate myself already? The rawness of the sentence startled me into silence. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he sat heavily on a bench near the hallway window and stared at his hands. I spent my whole life feeling behind everyone, he admitted quietly. I stayed standing. When Dad died, everything changed. Pain moved through me instantly, hearing Daniel mentioned aloud. Ethan continued staring downward. I know you worked hard. I know you sacrificed everything. But being poor changes how people see you. I closed my eyes briefly. Oh, Ethan. No, it's true. At school, I learned early not to talk about money, not to invite certain kids over, not to mention secondhand clothes. I thought of all the nights I stayed awake, trying to shield him from exactly those feelings. And somehow, despite all my effort, the shame still found him. When I met Nicole, he continued. Her family looked at me like I mattered. I almost said until they needed something, but I stayed quiet. Victor respected ambition, Ethan said softly. He talked to me like I could become more. And what exactly was wrong with who you already were? That question broke something inside him. His eyes filled immediately. You don't understand, he whispered. No, I replied painfully. I think I finally do. Because this wasn't just greed. Greed would almost be simpler. This was hunger. The desperate hunger to escape the emotional scars of growing up struggling. Nicole and Victor hadn't created Ethan's insecurity. They weaponized it. I sat beside him slowly. When your father was dying, I said quietly, he worried constantly that you'd feel ashamed of where we came from. Ethan looked at me sharply. He said the world teaches people to confuse wealth with value. Tears slipped down Ethan's face silently. I never meant for this to happen, but it did. We sat in silence while muffled music echoed from the ballroom. Then something occurred to me suddenly. Ethan, if Victor is truly in financial trouble, why are they spending this much money on the wedding? His face changed instantly. Tiny shift, but enough. What I asked sharply. He looked away. Ethan. He exhaled slowly. Nicole's family doesn't actually have as much money as people think anymore. Ice slid down my spine. How bad is it bad? And this wedding? He gave a hollow laugh. Mostly financed on credit. I stared at him in disbelief. The luxury ballroom, the designer clothes, the flowers, the champagne, all illusion, an expensive performance masking financial collapse. And suddenly Victor Harper made horrifying sense to me. Desperate men become dangerous, especially men obsessed with appearances. Did Nicole know I asked? Yes. Everything. Yes. That hurt differently. Because somewhere inside me, I had still hoped Nicole was merely spoiled, not calculating, not strategic. But she knew. All of it. She said once we merged finances, Ethan whispered things would recover. Merged finances. Such clean corporate language for emotional destruction. And my house. She said it was underused anyway. Underused. I nearly laughed again. The home where I spent 30 years surviving grief and raising her future husband reduced to a financial tool. At that moment, Carol appeared quietly at the far end of the hallway, carrying her leather briefcase. She stopped the second she saw Ethan crying beside me. None of us moved for a second. Then Carol walked toward us calmly. I just got off the phone with an attorney friend in Chicago, she said carefully. Ethan stiffened immediately. Carol looked directly at him. Victor Harper has 3 active civil lawsuits tied to failed commercial projects. The blood drained from Ethan's face. Carol opened her briefcase and handed me several printed pages. He's also leveraged multiple properties already. I scanned the paperwork quickly. Legal filings, debt disputes, default notices. My hands started trembling again. This is public record, I asked quietly. Yes. Ethan stood abruptly. No, Nicole said those cases were exaggerated. Carol's expression hardened. Of course she did. Then she delivered the sentence that changed everything. And based on these timelines, Leah's property was likely intended as part of a broader recovery strategy from the beginning. Silence. Complete silence. Ethan looked physically sick now, because finally, the illusion collapsed. Not just for me, for him too. Nicole hadn't simply wanted marriage, her family needed rescue, and somewhere along the line, they decided my life was acceptable collateral damage. Ethan looked like he might collapse. He leaned both hands against the hallway wall while staring at the legal documents Carol had printed. Civil lawsuits, debt restructuring filings, property disputes, page after page of financial instability hidden beneath the polished image Victor Harper presented to the world. "This can't be right," Ethan whispered. Carol's expression remained cold. "It's public record." "No." Nicole would have told me. The sadness I felt hearing that sentence was almost unbearable. Because even now, even standing in the wreckage part of my son, still wanted to believe the fantasy. Not because he was stupid, because accepting the truth meant admitting he'd sacrificed his mother for people who never truly respected him. Carol carefully slid the papers back into her briefcase. "We need to think clearly now," she said firmly. Ethan looked up slowly. "What happens if Victor loses those cases?" Carol answered without hesitation. "Financial collapse, potential bankruptcy exposure, asset seizures." I watched the realization spread across Ethan's face in slow, devastating waves. "That's why they needed the house," he whispered. "Not asked, needed." The difference mattered. I crossed my arms tightly against myself. How long before they planned to move me out? Neither Ethan nor Carol answered immediately. That silence was answer enough. My throat tightened painfully. All weekend I had kept asking myself one question. How could strangers treat me this way? But now I finally understood something worse. Strangers weren't the real danger. The real danger was the son who kept choosing silence while it happened. Carol glanced at me carefully. "Leah, I think it's time you show him the rest." I frowned slightly. "The rest?" She nodded toward the envelope from Daniel's lockbox sitting inside my purse. I had almost forgotten it. Slowly, I removed the thick folder and laid it across the hallway bench between us. Ethan stared at it uncertainly. "What is that?" I swallowed hard. "Something your father prepared before he died." The mention of Daniel instantly changed the air around us. Even after all these years, grief still entered rooms when his name appeared. I opened the folder carefully. Inside were copies of Daniel's estate planning documents, trust records, insurance information, and handwritten instructions. Carol gently handed Ethan the primary trust agreement. "Read page 4, she said. Ethan scanned the document quickly at first, then more slowly. Then his entire expression changed. "What? What is this?" My voice felt strangely calm now. "Your father established a protected trust before he died." Ethan looked up at me in confusion. "You told me he left a small life insurance policy." He did, but that wasn't everything. Years ago, Daniel and I had agreed not to tell Ethan the full truth until he was older and emotionally mature enough to handle it responsibly. Apparently, that day had never come. Ethan flipped through the papers again, stunned. "There's more money here than I thought." "Yes." How much I hesitated. "Enough." Carol answered more directly. "Enough that Victor Harper would absolutely want access to it." Ethan looked physically ill. Then he reached another section and froze completely. "Wait." His eyes moved rapidly across the page again. Then again. Finally, he whispered, "Mom?" I nodded slowly. "Yes." The trust remained under my control. Completely. Until Ethan turned 40. He stared at me in disbelief. "You control it?" "Your father wanted safeguards in place." "Against me?" "No," I said softly. "Against manipulation." The hallway fell silent again. I remembered the night Daniel finalized those documents. He'd been pale from chemotherapy, but painfully alert, sitting at our kitchen table while explaining every clause carefully. If anything ever feels wrong, he told me back then, protect Ethan from people who confuse him emotionally. At the time, I thought he meant scams, bad business partners, predatory lenders. I never imagined he meant the woman our son would marry. Ethan sat down heavily on the bench. Oh my God. Carol crossed her arms. That's why this became dangerous. Ethan looked up sharply. They didn't know about the trust? No, Carol replied, which means they likely believed Leah's house was the largest accessible asset. His breathing became uneven. They were planning around us without even understanding the full situation. I almost corrected him. Not us? Me? But exhaustion stopped me. Ethan suddenly looked terrified. What happens if Nicole finds out about the trust? Carol's answer came instantly. She absolutely cannot. Fear moved visibly across Ethan's face, because now he understood. This had never been temporary. Victor Harper's family had attached themselves to him strategically. Marriage, finances, property leverage, and eventually, the trust. I studied my son quietly. He looked shattered now, not because he suddenly became innocent, because the fantasy finally died. You loved her? I said softly. He closed his eyes. Yes, not past tense, present tense. That complicated my anger again. Love makes intelligent people ignore obvious danger every day, but love without honesty becomes something poisonous. Ethan rubbed both hands over his face. What do we do now? Carol answered before I could. We wait. Ethan blinked. Wait for what? For them to expose themselves publicly? He looked alarmed immediately. No, absolutely not. We can't create a scene at the wedding. There it was again. Appearance. Even now, humiliation frightened him more than betrayal. Carol's voice hardened. Your mother was nearly manipulated into surrendering control over her property and finances. I know that, then stop prioritizing optics. The sharpness in her tone stunned him silent. Carol stepped closer. Ethan listened carefully. Manipulative families survive because everyone around them avoids discomfort. She pointed toward the ballroom doors. Those people out there, they only know the polished version of Nicole Harper, the elegant version, the controlled version. Ethan stared downward. But truth surfaces eventually, Carol continued. And when it does, the question becomes whether decent people stayed silent while damage happened. The sentence landed heavily, because deep down, Ethan already knew he had failed that test. I sat beside him slowly. Why didn't you come to me? I asked quietly. His eyes filled instantly, because I knew you'd see through it. The honesty of that answer broke my heart more than lies ever could. You trusted her more than me. I wanted both worlds. He laughed bitterly through tears. The life Nicole offered, and the safety of knowing you'd always forgive me. There it was, the brutal truth. Children raised by sacrificial mothers sometimes become careless with our love because they mistake unconditional love for endless tolerance. I reached for his trembling hand anyway. Because motherhood is complicated. I would have helped you, I whispered. I know. No schemes, no manipulation, no shame. Fresh tears slid down his face. I know. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then music erupted loudly from the ballroom, nearby guests cheering for the bride and groom's entrance, reality pulling us back. Carol checked her watch. The reception speeches start soon. My stomach tightened. I already knew Nicole planned something. Women like her don't simply seek control privately. They establish social dominance publicly. Ethan suddenly looked panicked. You can't say anything tonight. I turned toward him slowly. Why? Because once this explodes, there's no fixing it. I held his gaze. Ethan, some things were already broken before tonight. Pain crossed his face again. Deep pain this time. Not fear of losing status, fear of losing family, and maybe finally, the understanding that he had helped create this disaster himself. Carol picked up her briefcase. Whatever happens next, she said calmly, make sure you're standing on the right side when the truth comes out. Then she walked toward the ballroom. I rose slowly beside Ethan. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then my son whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. I don't think Nicole ever really loved me. I looked at him carefully, and for the first time all weekend, I saw not a groom, not a banker, not a man chasing approval, just a frightened little boy realizing too late that some people only embrace you while calculating what they can take from you. By the time we returned to the ballroom, dessert was being served. The chandeliers cast golden light across crystal glasses and polished silverware, while soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers. Guests laughed over champagne and wedding cake, as if the evening were unfolding perfectly. Maybe to them it was. Most people never notice emotional violence unless someone finally screams. And I had spent most of my life learning how not to scream. Carol returned to her seat beside me, while Ethan disappeared toward the head table. I watched him walk back to Nicole slowly, like a man approaching a fire he already knew would burn him. Nicole looked radiant beneath the ballroom lights. She smiled when Ethan sat down beside her. But the moment her eyes found me across the room, the smile tightened. Not fear, not yet. Control. She still believed she controlled the room. A wedding coordinator tapped a microphone near the dance floor. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced brightly, "before dancing begins, our beautiful bride would like to say a few words." Applause filled the ballroom. Nicole stood gracefully, every movement elegant, measured, perfect. She lifted a champagne glass and smiled at the guests with practiced warmth. "I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight," she began. Her voice sounded soft and emotional enough to make strangers adore her instantly. "I've dreamed about this day since I was a little girl." Light laughter moved through the crowd. Nicole continued speaking about love, partnership, and building a future together. She thanked her parents first naturally. "My parents taught me the importance of discipline, standards, and protecting the people you love." Protecting. Interesting word. Then she turned toward Ethan with teary eyes that looked almost believable. "And Ethan, you're truly the best man I've ever known." Applause again. I glanced at Ethan. He wasn't smiling. Nicole kept speaking. "At the heart of marriage is creating healthy boundaries and building a stable future." My stomach tightened immediately. There it was, the setup. Nicole lifted her glass slightly higher. "And sometimes love means learning to let go of unhealthy attachments so new families can grow." The room remained politely attentive. Most guests probably heard nothing unusual in that sentence. But I did. So did Carol. And based on Ethan's expression, so did he. Nicole turned toward me then. Not fully, just enough. A carefully calculated movement. "And I know parents sometimes struggle with that transition," she continued gently, "especially mothers who dedicate their whole identity to their children." Several guests shifted awkwardly, tiny discomfort finally entering the room. Nicole smiled sympathetically. "But true love means allowing your children independence instead of emotional obligation." There it was. Public humiliation wrapped in polished language. My cheeks burned instantly. Around the ballroom, people glanced toward me discreetly. Some uncomfortable, some curious, some pitying. Nicole kept smiling. "I'm grateful Ethan and I are beginning our marriage with clarity, honesty, and healthy priorities." The cruelty of it nearly stole my breath. Not because she insulted me, because she did it strategically. Nicole wasn't trying to hurt my feelings. She was establishing social narrative. Emotionally dependent mother, overattached widow, burden, problem, obstacle. I suddenly understood exactly how carefully she had been building this image for years. Beside me, Carol leaned closer and whispered, "She's baiting you." I knew that. Nicole wanted emotional reaction. Crying, anger, a dramatic outburst she could point to later as proof of instability. For one dangerous second, I almost gave it to her, because humiliation burns hot, especially public humiliation, especially when delivered by someone young enough to mistake cruelty for sophistication. Then Ethan stood abruptly beside the head table. "Nicole." She touched his arm quickly without even looking at him. A silent warning. "Sit down." And unbelievably, he did. That hurt more than her speech. Because once again, my son chose silence in the moment that mattered most. Nicole raised her glass toward me now. So tonight, I also want to thank Leah. The entire ballroom looked in my direction. I felt every eye, every expectation. Nicole smiled sweetly. Thank you for raising Ethan to become such a compassionate and generous man. The compliment sounded poisoned somehow. And thank you for trusting us to help him build the stable future he deserves. Stable future. My fingers tightened around my napkin. I suddenly remembered the assisted living paperwork, the property transfers, the hallway conversations, the plans to move me out, and something inside me finally snapped. Not loudly, quietly, like a chain breaking after years of pressure. Nicole lifted her champagne glass. To new beginnings, the ballroom erupted into applause. Everyone raised their glasses. Everyone except me. I sat completely still. Across the room, Ethan looked terrified now because he saw it. The change in my face, the moment fear disappeared. Nicole noticed too. Her smile flickered slightly for the first time all night. Good. I rose slowly from my chair. The applause faded almost immediately. A strange hush settled across the ballroom. Nicole's expression remained composed, but I saw the calculation behind her eyes now. She was trying to predict me, trying to determine whether I would become emotional, messy, embarrassing, exactly the role she'd assigned me. I picked up my own champagne glass carefully. My voice, when it came, sounded calm, far calmer than I felt. I'd like to say a few words, too. Nicole hesitated, only briefly. Then she smiled tightly. Of course, Leah. The microphone was handed to me. It felt strangely heavy in my hands. For a moment, I simply looked around the ballroom. Beautiful flowers, expensive dresses, crystal chandeliers, and underneath it all, lies. I turned slowly toward Nicole. You're right about one thing, I said quietly. The room became perfectly silent. Marriage does create new beginnings. Nicole's smile stiffened. I continued softly. And healthy families absolutely need honesty. Ethan lowered his head immediately. Victor Harper's eyes narrowed from across the room. Sandra stopped smiling entirely. Good. Let them feel uncomfortable. I had been uncomfortable for years. I spent most of my life believing sacrifice automatically creates loyalty, I continued. My voice shook slightly now, but not from weakness, from truth. I believed loving someone enough meant they would protect your dignity in return. The ballroom remained frozen. No silverware clinking, no whispers, nothing. I looked directly at Ethan, then at Nicole. But sometimes I said quietly, people confuse kindness with permission to use you. Nicole finally spoke. Leah, maybe this isn't. No, I interrupted gently. I think this is exactly the right moment. Victor immediately stood from his table. Perhaps everyone's had too much champagne tonight. His voice carried sharp warning beneath fake politeness. Carol rose calmly beside me. Oh, I think sobriety is long overdue. Nicole's face changed then. For the first time all evening, real panic flashed across it, because suddenly she understood something terrifying. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to collapse. And I wasn't going to protect their secrets anymore. I set my untouched champagne glass down slowly. Then I looked directly at the hundreds of wedding guests staring at us in stunned silence. And finally, I told the truth. The silence inside the ballroom felt almost unreal. Hundreds of eyes stared at me, while soft jazz continued playing faintly through ceiling speakers, completely disconnected from the disaster unfolding beneath the chandeliers. Nicole stood frozen beside Ethan's champagne glass, still lifted halfway in the air. Victor Harper's jaw tightened visibly. Sandra looked horrified, and my son looked like a man watching his entire life split open in public. I tightened my grip on the microphone. For the last several months, I said calmly, there have been conversations happening about my future that I was never supposed to fully understand. Nicole recovered first. Leah, she said carefully, I think you may be misunderstanding private financial matters. No, Carol interrupted sharply from beside me. The misunderstanding ended when legal documents appeared. Murmurs spread immediately across the ballroom. Victor stepped forward instantly. This is inappropriate. I looked directly at him. What's inappropriate is preparing power of attorney documents for a healthy woman without her informed consent. The room exploded into whispers. Nicole's face lost color. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, like he physically couldn't bear hearing it aloud. Sandra laughed nervously. Oh, come on now. This is becoming dramatic. Dramatic. That word women use whenever older women stop suffering quietly. I reached into my purse and removed several folded documents. The movement alone changed the atmosphere completely, because paper makes truth harder to deny. These, I said steadily, were given to me under the claim they were temporary wedding financing forms. I held up the paperwork, but buried inside them were property transfer authorizations tied to my home. Several guests exchanged stunned looks. Victor moved toward me quickly. You have absolutely no understanding of commercial lending structures. Carol stepped directly between us before he could get closer. And you have absolutely no right pressuring a 63-year-old widow into signing concealed legal leverage agreements. Gasps rippled across nearby tables. Nicole finally lost part of her composure. That is not what happened. Then explain the assisted living paperwork. I replied calmly. Complete silence. Nicole froze. Sandra's wine glass nearly slipped from her hand. And suddenly, everyone knew. Because innocent people answer immediately. Guilty people panic first. Ethan finally spoke. It's true? His voice cracked through the ballroom like breaking glass. Every head turned toward him instantly. Nicole stared at him in disbelief. Ethan. He looked shattered now. Not groom-like, not polished, just broken. There were documents he admitted quietly. I knew about some of them. Nicole stepped toward him sharply. Do not do this here. But Ethan kept going. Victor said they were temporary financial protections. Victor exploded instantly. You weak little fool. The ballroom gasped. Nicole spun toward her father. Dad? But it was too late. The mask had slipped. Victor realized it too, though only seconds afterward. He straightened his jacket immediately, trying to regain control. This entire situation is being distorted emotionally. I looked directly at him. No, it's finally being described honestly. Carol opened her briefcase calmly and removed additional papers. I also obtained public financial records from Illinois this afternoon, she announced. Victor's face went white. Nicole noticed instantly. Fear entered her eyes for the first time all night. Real fear. Carol continued. These records show multiple pending lawsuits connected to failed real estate developments and significant debt exposure. The room erupted into louder whispers. Someone near the back actually pulled out a phone. Sandra grabbed Victor's arm. Victor! But he yanked away from her violently. Nicole turned toward Carol furiously. You had no right investigating my family. Carol didn't even blink. You tried to manipulate a widow into surrendering financial control over her property. Nicole's composure finally cracked completely. You don't understand anything. No, I replied softly. I understand perfectly now. I looked around the ballroom slowly, at the expensive flowers, the towering wedding cake, the designer gowns, the illusion. All of this, I said quietly, was funded while your family planned around my home behind my back. Nicole's eyes flashed with anger. We weren't stealing your house. Then why discuss moving me out after the honeymoon? Silence. Nicole's breathing became uneven. Victor stepped forward again. Enough. The single word sounded dangerous now. Not polished, not charming, just angry. I suddenly understood exactly how men like Victor survive socially. Charm in public, pressure in private, but pressure collapses once witnesses appear. Ethan looked physically sick. I didn't know how bad it was, he whispered. Nicole turned on him immediately. You're seriously doing this right now. Her voice had changed entirely. Gone was the elegant bride. Now she sounded cold, sharp, contemptuous. You told me your mother trusted you, she snapped. You said she'd sign eventually. The ballroom went dead silent again, because there it was, the truth. Not emotional concern, not family support, a transaction. Ethan stared at her in horror. Nicole. But she wasn't stopping anymore. Months of hidden frustration poured out of her face all at once. Do you have any idea how much pressure I've been under trying to fix everything? She hissed. Victor barked sharply, Nicole, but she ignored him. No, I'm done pretending. She looked directly at me now. You were always a complication. There it was, raw and ugly. Several guests visibly recoiled. Sandra whispered frantically. Nicole stopped talking, but Nicole's entire identity was collapsing publicly now, and rage had replaced control. You lived alone in a house too big for you, while Ethan struggled trying to build a future. I stared at her quietly. My son earns 6 figures, and it still wasn't enough. The confession exploded out before she could stop herself. Victor closed his eyes briefly. Finished. They were finished, because suddenly everyone understood. This wedding wasn't built on stability, it was built on desperation. Nicole pointed toward me with trembling hands. You don't understand what it's like trying to maintain appearances when everything is falling apart. I almost pitied her then. Almost. Because beneath all the cruelty sat a frightened woman terrified of losing status. But fear doesn't excuse exploitation, especially not of vulnerable people. You looked at me, I said softly, and saw someone easy to remove. Nicole laughed bitterly. You made yourself impossible to remove. Ethan was obsessed with protecting your feelings. The cruelty of the sentence visibly hit Ethan like a slap, because finally, he heard how Nicole truly viewed his love for his mother, not compassion, weakness. I looked toward my son slowly. His eyes were filled with devastation now, not only because the wedding was collapsing, because he finally saw himself clearly inside Nicole's world. Useful, manipulable, temporary, just like me. Victor suddenly grabbed Nicole's arm hard enough for her to flinch. We are leaving. But guests were already whispering openly now. Phones out, expressions shocked. One older woman near the front table shook her head slowly and whispered, "That poor mother." For years I had feared humiliation, feared looking emotional, feared seeming dramatic, but standing there beneath those ballroom lights, I realized something powerful. The shame never belonged to me. It belonged to the people who weaponized love for financial survival. Nicole looked around the room wildly, now realizing control had vanished completely. And for the first time since this nightmare began, she looked small. The ballroom no longer looked elegant. It looked exposed. The chandeliers still glittered overhead. The flowers still overflowed from crystal vases. The string quartet still sat frozen near the dance floor, clutching their instruments awkwardly. But now everyone could see what had been hiding underneath the luxury. Fear, greed, desperation. Victor Harper released Nicole's arm slowly when he realized people were staring at him. Too late. The damage was already done. Nicole stood in the center of the ballroom, breathing hard mascara, beginning to smudge beneath her eyes for the first time all day. And Ethan, my son, looked completely shattered. Not embarrassed anymore. Destroyed. Because there's a moment in every deception when the liar finally realizes the fantasy is dead. This was that moment. Everybody needs to calm down, Sandra said suddenly, forcing a brittle smile onto her face. This has clearly become an emotional misunderstanding. Carol gave a short laugh. A misunderstanding doesn't involve hidden power of attorney paperwork. Sandra's smile collapsed immediately. Victor pointed sharply toward Carol. You inserted yourself into private family business. No, Carol replied calmly. I stepped in when vulnerable people were being manipulated. Several guests nodded subtly now. The social current inside the ballroom had shifted completely. I could feel it. An hour earlier, People viewed me as the emotional, older mother struggling to let go. Now they were looking at Nicole and Victor like predators caught in daylight. Nicole turned toward Ethan desperately. Say something. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. What exactly would you like me to say that this was never supposed to happen like this? The sentence echoed through the room, and again truth slipped out accidentally. Not supposed to happen like this. Meaning, it was supposed to happen. Just quietly, privately, without witnesses. Ethan took a slow step backward away from her. The movement was small, but emotionally enormous. Nicole noticed immediately. Fear flashed across her face. Not heartbreak. Fear of losing control. You're really turning against me, she whispered. Ethan laughed once, a broken sound. You tried to use my mother's house? Nicole shook her head frantically. No, we were trying to survive. There it is, Carol muttered quietly beside me. Survive? Not love, not partnership. Survival strategy. Victor stepped forward again, voice colder now. You have no idea what financial pressure does to people. I looked directly at him. Pressure reveals people. It doesn't create them. That landed. I saw it in his eyes. Victor Harper had spent years justifying ugly choices by calling them necessary. Necessary for appearances, necessary for status, necessary for survival. Men like him always believe desperation excuses exploitation. It doesn't. Nicole suddenly turned toward me fully. And finally, completely, the mask disappeared. You want the truth? She snapped. The ballroom froze again. Nicole Sandra warned sharply. But Nicole looked beyond stopping now. Years of resentment poured out of her face all at once. Yes, I answered quietly. I do. She pointed toward me with shaking hands. I was tired of Ethan revolving his entire life around you. Pain moved visibly through Ethan's face. Nicole kept going. Every decision involved your feelings. Every holiday, every plan, every conversation. I'm his mother, and I was supposed to become his wife. The room remained breathlessly silent. Nicole laughed bitterly through tears. You know what Victor always said, she continued, that Ethan would never fully belong in our world until he stopped acting guilty about where he came from. Ethan physically flinched, because suddenly he heard it aloud. Belong. That had always been the bait. Not money. Belonging. Nicole looked at him now with pure frustration. You said you wanted more than that little house and small town life. The cruelty of the sentence hit me less than it hit Ethan, because now he realized something devastating. Nicole had never misunderstood his insecurity. She had studied it, fed it, used it. You were ashamed of me? I whispered. Ethan turned toward me instantly. Mom. But I could already see the truth in his eyes. Not total shame, not hatred. Something sadder. Embarrassment. The kind children sometimes carry secretly when parents remind them of painful origins they're trying to outrun. Tears filled Ethan's eyes immediately. I never wanted to lose you. Nicole laughed sharply. She was never going anywhere. That was the whole problem. Gasps spread again across the ballroom. Sandra covered her face with one trembling hand. Victor looked furious now, not at the manipulation itself, but at the public collapse of image. And suddenly, I understood something clearly. Nicole didn't become this way accidentally. She learned it. From them. From years inside a family where appearances mattered more than integrity. Ethan stared at Nicole like he no longer recognized her. Did you ever love me? He asked quietly. The question broke something open inside the room, because beneath all the financial manipulation, that was the real heartbreak. Nicole hesitated, just for a second, but seconds matter, especially when truth arrives. I did, she answered finally. Past tense. Ethan noticed too. I watched devastation move across my son's face in real time, not just because the marriage was collapsing, because he finally understood he had sacrificed pieces of himself for people who only valued him conditionally. Victor stepped closer toward Ethan immediately. Don't be naive. Marriage involves practical realities. Ethan turned slowly toward him. No, he whispered. Using people involves practical realities. Good. Finally. Victor's expression darkened dangerously. You think you're morally superior now? You were happy enough accepting our connections and opportunities. The accusation hit because it was partly true. Ethan lowered his head, and there it was again. The tragedy of weakness. Not evil. Weakness. My son had not orchestrated this nightmare, but he allowed himself to drift toward it because he wanted approval badly enough to ignore warning signs. That realization hurt in a deeper way than outright cruelty would have, because weakness destroys quietly. Nicole suddenly began crying for real now. Not elegant tears, messy ones. You don't understand the pressure we were under, she whispered. I looked at her carefully, and for one fleeting moment, I almost saw the frightened woman beneath the manipulation. Almost. But then I remembered the hallway. After tomorrow, you're not family anymore. The assisted living paperwork? The plans to move me out? No. Fear explains behavior. It doesn't erase responsibility. Guests had begun quietly leaving now, whispering among themselves while avoiding eye contact with the Harper family. The wedding reception was dying in real time. A string player quietly packed away her violin. One waiter accidentally dropped a tray in the kitchen area because everyone was staring. And standing there in the middle of the collapsing ballroom, Ethan suddenly looked very young again. Lost. Ashamed. Human. He turned toward me slowly. I'm sorry. 2 simple words, but they carried the weight of months, maybe years. I looked at him carefully. My beautiful boy. My difficult boy. The child I loved enough to destroy myself for if I wasn't careful. And suddenly I realized something painful but necessary. Love without boundaries becomes permission. I walked closer to Ethan until we stood face to face beneath the ballroom lights. You betrayed me? I said softly. Fresh tears filled his eyes. I know. You let people discuss my future like I was disposable. His shoulders shook. I know. And you stayed silent. That one nearly broke him completely, because silence had been his greatest failure, not greed, cowardice. I touched his face gently anyway. Because motherhood doesn't disappear just because trust does. I still love you, I whispered. Ethan started crying openly then. But things cannot go back to the way they were. And for the first time all night, he finally understood that consequences had arrived. Real ones. Not financial. Emotional. The kind that changed families forever. 3 months after the wedding collapsed, I planted tulips in my backyard for the first time in years. It sounds small, doesn't it? But grief changes your relationship with ordinary things. For a long time after Daniel died, I stopped planting flowers because I couldn't bear watching beautiful things bloom and disappear again. Then life became survival. Bills, work, raising Ethan, protecting everyone else emotionally while quietly abandoning myself. Somewhere along the way, I forgot I was a person outside motherhood. That changed after the wedding. Not all at once. Healing never happens dramatically the way movies pretend it does. It happens in tiny moments. The first full night of sleep after weeks of anxiety. The first morning you realize your stomach no longer knots when your phone rings. The first time you sit alone in silence and feel peace instead of loneliness. That spring, my backyard slowly came back to life. And so did I. The legal aftermath surrounding the Harper family unfolded quickly after the wedding disaster. Once Victor's financial troubles became public among business circles, more information surfaced fast. Additional lawsuits, hidden debt, questionable refinancing practices. The carefully polished image Victor and Sandra spent years constructing cracked almost overnight. Nicole moved back to Chicago within weeks. I heard through mutual acquaintances that the marriage paperwork had never been finalized legally because the reception chaos interrupted several remaining documents that were supposed to be completed afterward. Strange, isn't it? A wedding filled with hidden paperwork ultimately died because truth interrupted signatures. I didn't celebrate that. Contrary to what some people believe, emotional justice rarely feels joyful. Mostly it feels sad. Because even when toxic people lose power, relationships still die beside them. And death, emotional or otherwise, always carries grief. Ethan struggled the hardest. The first month after the wedding, he barely contacted me. Not out of anger. Shame? I think humiliation swallowed him whole for a while. He took leave from work after rumors from the reception spread through social circles and eventually into professional ones. Columbus isn't a small town, but wealthy circles shrink quickly when scandal appears. One afternoon in late February, he showed up unexpectedly at my front door. No expensive suit, no polished banker confidence, just jeans, tired eyes, and emotional exhaustion. I almost didn't recognize him. We sat at my kitchen table drinking coffee in silence for several minutes before he finally spoke. I started therapy. I looked up slowly. That sentence alone took courage, especially for Ethan. How's it going? He gave a weak laugh. Apparently, I have issues with validation. Despite everything, I smiled slightly. That doesn't sound shocking. He nodded quietly. Then his expression changed, more serious. The therapist asked me something last week. What? She asked why I spent so much of my adult life chasing approval from people who looked down on me. I stayed silent because I already knew the answer. Children who grow up feeling less than often spend adulthood trying to earn worth from people who reinforce the wound. Ethan wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. I think part of me blamed you for our struggles growing up, he admitted softly. The honesty hurt, but not as much as lies had. I know. His eyes filled instantly. You know mothers always know. I reached across the table and touched his hand gently. But Ethan, surviving hardship is not something to be ashamed of. Fresh tears slid down his face. I made you feel ashamed. No, I corrected quietly. You made choices because you were ashamed. That distinction mattered. One makes me responsible for his wound, the other makes him responsible for healing it. And healing, I was learning, requires accountability, not endless forgiveness without change. Over time, Ethan began visiting more often, slowly, carefully, like someone rebuilding a house after a fire. We talked honestly in ways we never had before about class, money, embarrassment, loneliness, the strange pressure men feel to appear successful at all costs, and the dangerous ways people exploit insecurity. One evening, Ethan finally asked the question, sitting between us for months, will you ever trust me again? I looked at him for a long time before answering. Yes. Hope flashed across his face instantly. Then I continued, but not blindly. That part hurt him. I could see it, but it was necessary. Because forgiveness without boundaries is just permission for repeated harm. And at 63 years old, I had finally learned the difference. I updated my will that summer, not out of revenge, out of wisdom. Carol helped me establish clearer protections around the house finances and trust Daniel created years earlier. When I thanked her one afternoon over lunch, she laughed. Leah women our age were trained to believe protecting ourselves was selfish. Maybe she was right. So many women from my generation learned how to nurture everyone except ourselves. We called it love. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it was fear of abandonment disguised as sacrifice. I joined a church gardening group that spring, started traveling occasionally with Carol, cut my hair shorter, bought brighter clothes, tiny things. But every small choice felt like reclaiming pieces of myself I had abandoned somewhere inside widowhood and motherhood. One afternoon, while planting roses near the porch, Ethan arrived carrying a cardboard box. What's that? I asked. He smiled awkwardly. Something I found in storage. Inside the box sat dozens of old photographs. Me holding him as a baby, Daniel teaching him to ride a bike, birthday parties, school concerts, Christmas mornings. There was one photo in particular that nearly broke me. A picture of 8-year-old Ethan hugging me beside the red bicycle I sacrificed so much to buy. On the back, in crooked childhood handwriting, he had written, "My mom always takes care of me." I sat on the porch steps crying quietly while Ethan stood nearby. "I forgot who you were for a while," he whispered. I shook my head slowly. "No, you forgot who you were. That mattered too, because people can lose themselves trying to belong in worlds built on performance. The important thing is whether they choose honesty once the illusion collapses." Ethan did. Eventually. Not perfectly, not quickly, but sincerely. And maybe that's what healing actually looks like. Not pretending damage never happened, learning how to live truthfully afterward. These days, my home feels peaceful again. Not because life became perfect, because I finally stopped confusing love with self erasure. I still love my son deeply. I probably always will. But now I understand something I wish more women were taught earlier. Being needed is not the same thing as being respected. And no relationship, not even motherhood, should require you to surrender your dignity just to keep someone close. For most of my life, I believed unconditional love meant endless sacrifice. I thought being a good mother meant forgiving everything, understanding everything, and shrinking myself whenever necessary to keep the people I loved comfortable. But life taught me something painful and freeing at the same time. Love without boundaries can become permission for mistreatment. Many women, especially mothers, spend decades putting everyone else first. We excuse disrespect because we're afraid of conflict. We tolerate emotional neglect because we don't want to lose our families. And sometimes we stay silent so long that people begin believing our silence means weakness. It doesn't. Kindness is not weakness. Patience is not weakness. Forgiveness is not weakness. But protecting yourself matters too. What happened to me with Ethan and Nicole wasn't really about money or property in the end. It was about shame, insecurity appearances, and the dangerous human need to feel accepted by the wrong people. And sadly, many good people lose themselves chasing validation from those who never intended to love them honestly. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this: you can love people deeply and still refuse to let them harm you. You can forgive someone and still require accountability. And you are never too old to reclaim your voice, your peace, or your dignity. Sometimes healing begins the moment you finally stop apologizing for protecting yourself. If this story touched your heart, I'd truly love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to set boundaries with someone you love deeply, and where are you watching from tonight? Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy emotional family stories like this one. Thank you for spending this time with me, and remember your kindness should never cost you your self-respect.